there is a number that should not exist. In 5 years of combat, deep inside the most dangerous jungle on the planet, surrounded by an enemy that outnumbered them 50 to 1, a small group of soldiers lost just 3 men. 3. While 500,000 American troops were bleeding into the Vietnamese soil, while entire battalions were being swallowed by the jungle and spat back out in body bags, this tiny force moved through the same killing ground like water through smoke. The enemy did not call them soldiers. They called them monsoon, forest demons. And they weren't entirely wrong, because these men did not fight the way anyone else fought. They did not announce themselves with roaring engines or thundering artillery. They arrived in silence, and they departed in silence. And the only proof that they had ever been there was the smoking ruin they left behind. Tonight, we are opening the classified file. We are going to take you inside the operations that history books refuse to discuss. The psychological trap that turned 80 enemy fighters into target practice. The sniper duel fought in a blinding monsoon. The rescue mission that an entire Marine regiment said was impossible. And the moment when a captured enemy officer, a hardened, combat-experienced commander, sat across from his interrogators and said 4 words that tell you everything. We fear the silence. This is the story of the Australian SAS in Vietnam, the Ghost Army, the phantoms of the jungle, the men who proved that silence is the most devastating weapon ever invented. Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam, March 17th, 1966, 3 in the morning. Van Men had survived 2 years in this jungle. 2 years of American carpet bombing, of helicopters circling overhead, of patrols crashing through the undergrowth like drunk water buffalo. He had survived all of it because he understood this place. He had learned to read the wind, to hear the difference between a branch disturbed by an animal and a branch disturbed by a boot, to smell the enemy long before they arrived, the sweet chemical reek of their insect repellent, the tobacco that clung to their uniforms, the metallic scent of American fear. He was the apex predator of his sector, standing guard over a base that housed 18 elite fighters, 2 weapons caches, and a critical communications relay. He had personally designed the perimeter himself, a web of tripwires and dry bamboo noisemakers stretching hundreds of meters in every direction. Nothing moved through his jungle without his knowledge. That was what he believed. He was checking his watch, about to signal his partner to begin the next rotation, when the night around him simply shifted. He did not hear footsteps. He did not hear breathing. He did not hear the rustle of a uniform against a leaf. The only sensation he experienced was a pressure against his shoulder, gentle, almost friendly, as a gloved hand closed over his mouth with the force of a hydraulic press. It took less than 5 seconds. His partner, turning to begin the next shift exactly 90 seconds later, met the same fate before his eyes could fully adjust to the dark. On the outer perimeter, 3 more sentries were removed with the same surgical efficiency. No shots, no struggle, no alarm. In 90 seconds, 5 trained fighters had been silently erased from the war. By 4 in the morning, 4 men had moved through the entire sleeping camp like a cold wind, bypassing booby traps that would have crippled a regular infantry patrol, planting timed explosives on every weapons cache and communications device with mathematical precision. And then they vanished. They left no footprints, no trail for trackers to follow. Nothing but the arranged bodies of the sentries, placed at the center of the smoking ruins in a deliberate, unnatural pattern, not out of cruelty, out of calculation. The message was written without words. Nowhere is safe. We can touch you whenever we want. In Hanoi, intelligence officers spent the next 3 years trying to understand what had happened in that camp. The reports that landed on their desks were full of disbelief. No survivors, no prisoners, no shell casings, just empty air and the lingering smell of cordite. The legend had been born, and it was only just beginning. To understand what made the Australian SAS so terrifying, you first have to understand what they were walking into. By 1966, America had deployed 500,000 troops to Vietnam. They had M16 rifles, Huey helicopter gunships, B-52 bombers, artillery battalions, and a military budget larger than the entire GDP of most nations. Their strategy was built on one foundational belief: overwhelming force wins wars. Find the enemy, Kit him with everything, count the bodies, move on. American General William Westmoreland, reviewing Allied contributions in 1964, described the British and Australian offer of counterinsurgency expertise with thinly veiled contempt. Whether their methods suit our operational tempo remains to be seen. It was the kind of arrogance that comes from having the biggest weapons in the room. The Australians did not take offense. They had been here before, not in Vietnam, but in Malaya, in Borneo. A decade and a half of fighting communist insurgencies through jungle terrain that ate conventional military thinking alive. They had learned lessons written in blood and patience in swamp water and 12-year campaigns. They had learned that the jungle is neutral. It does not favor the powerful, it favors the quiet. The Australian SAS Regiment that arrived in Phuoc Tuy Province in 1966 was drawn from soldiers who had survived a selection course with a 90% failure rate. 110 men, organized into small patrol units of 4 to 6 operators. No heavy weapons, no armored vehicles, no battalion-strength sweeps, just men and silence. Where American patrols moved in groups of 30 or 40, creating a noise footprint detectable for kilometers, the Australians moved in teams small enough to hide behind a termite mound. Where American soldiers consumed 3 days of rations in a single day of operations, an SAS patrol could sustain itself for 2 full weeks on the same supplies. The philosophical difference was captured perfectly by British SAS Major Peter Walsh, who served as an advisor in the early years. "We wanted to understand the enemy first," he explained, "then remove him surgically. Understand, then remove." 2 different wars fought in the same jungle. And the Viet Cong, who had faced the French and survived American carpet bombing, initially dismissed the new arrivals as irrelevant. A few dozen foreign soldiers hiding in the bush. What could they possibly matter against divisions of battle-hardened fighters who owned the jungle? They were about to find out. By early 1967, the Australian SAS had become a problem that the North Vietnamese High Command could no longer ignore. Their supply lines were bleeding, their base camps were disappearing, and the worst part, they had no idea how it was happening. No contact reports, no intelligence of enemy movement, just empty camps and destroyed equipment where thriving operations had been the day before. The Viet Cong trackers were getting better. They were learning to find the faint chemical traces of soap and toothpaste, a subtle impression of a boot in soft mud, a torn edge of a leaf at waist height. The enemy was adapting. The Australian SAS did not see this as a threat. They saw it as an invitation. What followed was classified for years. It was called Operation Spider's Web, and it was one of the most psychologically devastating traps ever set in the history of guerrilla warfare. The premise was simple, brutal, and required nerves that most human beings simply do not possess. If they want to find us, let's show them exactly where to look. A 4-man SAS patrol, call sign Dagger 2, was tasked with the mission. But instead of moving through the jungle like the ghosts they were, they moved like amateurs. They broke branches. They left faint boot impressions on the edge of a trail. They even dropped an empty ration wrapper, an unforgivable sin by SAS standards, in a location where Viet Cong trackers were known to operate. It was a performance, calculated, precise, and designed to be almost, but not quite obvious enough to smell like a trap. They led the trackers deep into a pre-selected kill zone, a small clearing surrounded by towering mahogany trees, the ground below open and flat, the canopy above dense and dark. In the center of the clearing, the patrol built a campsite that was a masterwork of deliberate incompetence. Shallow sleeping pits dug in the wrong positions, empty tins of beef scattered near a fire pit, cigarette butts ground into the dirt, the unmistakable signature of a lazy, undisciplined unit that had no idea they were being watched. As darkness fell, Dagger 2 did not crawl into those sleeping pits. They went up, using ropes and the kind of upper body strength that comes from years of brutal physical preparation. 4 men hauled themselves 20 meters into the canopy, strapping themselves to the branches, settling in for the long, agonizing wait, breathing slowly, not moving, watching the forest floor below them with the patience of men who understood that patience is not waiting. Patience is the weapon. At 2 a.m, the jungle floor came alive. A Viet Cong company, nearly 80 heavily armed fighters, moving toward the campsite with the confidence of executioners who believe their target is sleeping. From the canopy 20 meters above, 4 Australian soldiers watched them come, hearts hammering, breathing in microscopic sips of air, every instinct in the human body screaming to move, to act, to do something. They did nothing. The enemy stormed the camp at 2:15 in the morning. Grenades into the sleeping pits. Automatic fire shredding the bedrolls. Bayonets stabbing the ground. 80 fighters conducting a massacre of empty blankets. 10 seconds of chaos. Then total silence. Then the dawning horror of the realization there was nobody there. That was when the sky fell. High above in the canopy, the SAS commander whispered 3 words into his radio handset. Drop it now. 5 kilometers away, a New Zealand artillery battery had been waiting. The coordinates had been pre-calculated to the single meter. No adjustment shots needed. The first salvo landed directly in the center of the clearing. The earth erupted. From the treetops, the 4 Australians watched the destruction of a company that had outnumbered them 20-1. When the smoke cleared the following morning, the survivors had fled. They left behind not just their dead, but something more valuable, their confidence. Because now, every piece of trash found in the jungle was a potential trap. Every boot print, every mistake, every empty campfire could be the first thread of another web. The hunters had become afraid of the jungle itself. March 1966, deep in Phuc Tuy province. A 4-man SAS patrol, call sign Charlie 1, commanded by a sergeant his men called Iron Jim. They were set up in a classic observation post overlooking a junction of jungle trails, hidden inside a dense wall of bamboo and wait-a-while vines, painted into invisibility, lying completely flat in the leaf litter, while the temperature climbed past 35 degrees and the humidity made every breath feel like drinking warm water. For hours, nothing. Insects, shadows, the slow drip of condensation from the canopy above, and then the jungle came alive. A Viet Cong company appeared on the trail. Not a patrol, not a squad, a full combat unit. 20 heavily armed men. They moved with the unhurried ease of soldiers who had been operating in this territory for months and had never once felt threatened. Standard operating procedure for a 4-man reconnaissance team facing a force 5 times its size is unambiguous. Break contact, withdraw, live to fight another day. Iron Jim did not move because he noticed something. The enemy commander raised his hand. The column halted. Rifles were stacked against the trees. Heavy packs came off tired shoulders. The men sat down in the shade 30 meters from the SAS position. A rest break, 30 meters. The distance you could throw a stone across. What followed was 43 minutes of psychological pressure that most human beings cannot imagine. Lying on your stomach in the dirt, 20 armed men sitting close enough to hear their conversation, to smell the smoke from their cigarettes, to see the individual faces of the men cleaning their weapons and passing around bowls of rice. Your face pressed into the earth, an ant crawling across the back of your hand, a mosquito drilling into the side of your neck. You cannot move, you cannot flinch, you cannot scratch, you cannot breathe deeply, because a deep breath might rustle a dry leaf, and a dry leaf might end everything. Iron Jim watched the second hand of his watch. 5 minutes, 10, 20, 30. The enemy laughed, shared food, argued about something, then laughed again. They had absolutely no idea that 4 men were lying in the dirt, watching their every move from 30 meters away. At the 43-minute mark, the enemy commander stood up. Rifles were collected. Packs went back on. The column assembled and began moving down the trail. The last fighter disappeared around the bend. Iron Jim did not give the order to withdraw. He whispered into his radio, "We are following." 4 men, in complete silence, began shadowing a 20-man combat unit through 2 kilometers of dense jungle, moving parallel to the trail, invisible, patient, watching where the column went, what buildings they entered, what routes they used. The enemy led them directly home. A fortified base camp, weapons caches, rice stores, a communications center, a battalion headquarters that no intelligence report had ever located. Iron Jim recorded everything, and that night, from a safe distance, he called in the coordinates with quiet precision. The following morning, the sky opened. 67 confirmed enemy fighters were removed from the war. Months of stockpiled weapons were destroyed, and the Viet Cong never understood how they had been found. They died believing the sky itself had betrayed them. They never knew that 4 men had watched them eat their lunch. By the summer of 1967, Hanoi had run out of patience. The humiliation of Operation Spider's Web, the bleeding of supply lines, the constant invisible pressure of a force they could neither locate nor engage. The North Vietnamese High Command made a decision. They sent a specialist. His identity was never fully established. His call sign, used in intercepted communications with a tone of reverence that made Australian intelligence officers sit up straight, was the Cobra. He had trained with Soviet special forces. He carried a modified bolt-action rifle that required the kind of skill that cannot be taught, only born. 3 senior American officers in the Central Highlands had already been removed by his hand. His mission was singular: hunt the hunters. Most military units, upon learning that a legendary specialist sniper is actively hunting their commanders, respond in predictable ways. They reinforce their perimeters. They call for additional support. They reduce their exposure and wait for the threat to be neutralized by someone else. The Australian SAS did the opposite. They went looking for him. A 4-man team from 2 Squadron volunteered for the job, led by a sergeant whose men called him Bluey. They took no additional armor, no reinforcement, no backup extraction plan. They took water, ammunition, and patience, which in the Australian SAS is considered sufficient for any situation. The duel began on a Tuesday morning under a sky that was drowning the jungle in monsoon rain, the kind of rain that hits exposed skin like thrown gravel. Visibility reduced to less than 50 meters in every direction. The jungle transformed into a gray, shifting curtain of water and noise. For 24 hours, nothing, just movement, just the exhausting centimeter by centimeter crawl through terrain that seemed designed specifically to kill you. 400 meters covered in 12 hours. The knowledge that somewhere in this gray hell, a man with extraordinary skills was watching the same jungle, waiting for the same mistake. On the second day, a psychological weight began to press on the edges of conscious thought. Every falling branch sounded like a bolt being chambered. Every shadow in the peripheral vision looked like a rifle barrel. The Cobra was good. He left false trails, broken vegetation that led into open ground, where a man following the path would have been completely exposed. Bluey and his team recognized the bait. They went around, crawling on their stomachs through mud that smelled of decay, moving slower than the rain itself. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, 72 hours without sleep, skin white and shriveled from the constant wet, every muscle in their bodies reduced to burning wire. The break came. Not a sound, not a movement, a disruption in the pattern of the rain. Bluey, peering through the gray curtain, noticed a patch of elephant grass 80 meters ahead that was not moving with the wind. Every other blade of grass in that field was bending and recovering in the same rhythm. This patch was rigid. Something was bracing it. He signaled his scout. They froze. Through his scope, the world was a blur of gray water and shifting shadows. And then lightning split the valley. A single strobe flash of white light that lasted less than a second. In that instant, Bluey saw him, wrapped in wet Hessian sacking that matched the mud precisely, completely invisible to the naked eye. Rifle raised, aimed at his scout's position, finger tightening on the trigger. There was no time to calculate, no time to check range or windage. The thunder was still rolling across the valley. Bluey fired. The shot that should not have been possible, 80 meters through a blinding storm at a target the size of a grapefruit, found its mark. When they reached the body, they found a diary wrapped in oilskin. The final entry, written that same morning, read, "The rain hides me, but I feel them watching. The forest has eyes."
While the SAS were winning the war in the air and on the ground, the Americans were confronting a mystery that was beginning to genuinely frighten the Pentagon. Entire Viet Cong battalions were disappearing. Aircraft would spot a formation, radio in the coordinates, and by the time ground forces arrived, nothing. Empty jungle, no tracks, no equipment, no sign that hundreds of men had ever been there. The answer was found, not by satellite imagery or intelligence analysis, but by a single Australian SAS corporal with sharp eyes and a disturbing instinct for things that are wrong. January 1966, Operation Crimp, a standard sweep through the Hobo Woods north of Saigon. The American strategy was the usual hammer, artillery, armor, Infantry sweep. Wait for the enemy to run. The enemy did not run. The corporal, his men called him the Digger, was leading his patrol along the edge of a rubber plantation when he stopped dead and raised his fist. To every other eye in the patrol, the patch of jungle floor in front of them looked identical to everything surrounding it. Rotting leaves, damp earth, the ordinary chaos of a forest floor. But the Digger had noticed something. A pile of leaves that was too dry, too perfectly arranged, and the dirt beneath them was a shade lighter than the surrounding mud. Fresh earth, camouflaged with extraordinary skill. He lifted the edge of the foliage with his bayonet and revealed a wooden trapdoor the size of a man's shoulders. What the Allies discovered in the following days obliterated everything they thought they understood about the war. The Ku Chai tunnel system, not a few foxholes, not a bolt hole network, a subterranean city stretching over 200 kilometers, built by hand, with hand tools, over years of fanatical labor, fully functioning hospitals, weapons factories, printing presses, sleeping quarters for thousands of soldiers. The Americans had been fighting on the surface. The enemy had been living, planning, and sleeping beneath their boots. For American soldiers, the tunnels became a source of pure psychological horror. They sent tunnel rats, small, wiry volunteers armed with only a flashlight and a pistol, crawling into spaces too narrow to turn around in, fighting in absolute darkness against an enemy who had laid venomous snakes behind blind corners and punji stakes beneath false floors. The Australian SAS did not send men into the meat grinder. They treated the tunnels as a structural engineering problem. They mapped the ventilation shafts, tiny bamboo tubes camouflaged inside termite mounds, kilometers from the main entrances. They identified the air intakes, and then they suffocated the city. CS gas pumped into the ventilation network until smoke poured from the ground, like the earth was on fire, driving the occupants to the surface or into unconsciousness. When sections needed to be destroyed, they didn't use grenades. They calculated the structural weak points and collapsed entire galleries, burying the tunnel system inside itself. No heroics, no drama, an engineering solution to a military problem. And still, the enemy had no idea how they were found. Late 1968, a distress signal crackled through the static above the Iron Triangle, the most heavily defended piece of ground in South Vietnam. A covert CIA helicopter, a pilot with clearance above general officer level, classified documents, down somewhere in 2,000 square kilometers of jungle crawling with North Vietnamese regulars. The Marine commander who received the coordinates looked at his map and made the rational assessment. Sending a recovery force into that concentration of enemy fighters was not a rescue mission. It was mass suicide. The documents were considered lost. The pilot was written off as dead. The jets were already being prepared to bomb the crash site into unrecognizable debris. 4 men raised their hands. An SAS patrol, call sign Ghost 4, stepped forward for the mission that the Marines had refused. They did not ask for air cover. They did not ask for a quick reaction force on standby. They asked for darkness. As the sun disappeared and the jungle closed itself in black, the 4 Australians crossed the wire and stepped into the enemy's territory. 6 hours of movement through a landscape saturated with enemy soldiers, crawling through waist-deep mud, passing sentry positions with centimeters to spare, navigating minefields in complete darkness, reading the ground by touch alone. At one point, the point man stopped mid-step and held his position, 1 foot suspended in the air, while an enemy patrol passed so close he could have reached out and touched them. He held the position. Before dawn, they found the wreckage. The pilot was alive, barely. Badly injured, unable to walk, concealed in a thicket of bamboo with the classified documents still strapped to his chest, 2 kilometers from the nearest enemy camp. 4 men, 180-pound casualty, 12 miles of swamp between them and safety. For 10 hours, the team took turns carrying the wounded American, moving with agonizing slowness, dodging 3 separate enemy search parties, submerging themselves in leech-infested water, with the injured man balanced between them to avoid detection, not firing a single round, because a single round would have been the end of all of them. When they emerged from the tree line and staggered into the Allied base, the American commander stood and stared. The pilot was alive. The documents were intact. The 4 SAS troopers cleaned their weapons, ate a hot meal, and began preparing for the next patrol.
By 1969, the Viet Cong were no longer just losing soldiers, they were losing their minds. The Australian SAS had launched a psychological campaign that was as precisely engineered as any of their military operations. It began with the ambushes. When an SAS team neutralized an enemy patrol, they did not simply withdraw. They left messages, handwritten notes in flawless Vietnamese, pinned to the uniforms of the fallen. Simple, direct, devastating. We are watching you. You are never safe. Go home while you still can. It was a violation of the one thing the jungle had always provided the Viet Cong, the sense that the jungle was theirs, that they were safe inside it. Then came what the SAS called the step up. They had studied the enemy's standard response to an ambush: retreat 500 meters, regroup, counterattack. Predictable, disciplined, and utterly lethal to those who practiced it against the Australians. Because the Australians were waiting for them at the 500-meter mark. And when the survivors of the second engagement scattered and ran toward their fallback rendezvous point, a third team was already there. A conveyor belt of destruction, powered entirely by the knowledge of how the enemy thought. Viet Cong interrogation reports from this period describe something that military commanders rarely see: genuine, widespread operational paranoia. Enemy soldiers stopped trusting their commanders' route selections. They stopped sleeping soundly. They began reporting to their officers that the Australians could walk through trees, could see in the dark, could appear from the earth itself. One captured officer, during his debriefing, spoke with a trembling simplicity that said everything. We fear the silence more than the bombs. The jungle, their greatest asset, their home, their sanctuary, had turned against them. When the Australian SAS withdrew from Vietnam in 1971, the accountants of war sat down with their ledgers. Approximately 600 Australian SAS operators had rotated through the conflict over 5 years, a microscopic force against 500,000 American troops, a drop of water in an ocean of firepower. Their confirmed eliminations exceeded 500 enemy combatants, not counting the thousands destroyed by the artillery they called in or the logistics networks they dismantled. The Viet Cong eventually abandoned vast sections of Phuoc Tuy province entirely, not because of sweeps or bombing campaigns, because the cost of operating in SAS territory was simply too high. They could not move safely. They could not rest. They could not plan. Every route was potentially watched. Every camp was potentially compromised. Every moment of stillness in the jungle carried the possibility that 4 men were lying in the dirt 30 meters away taking notes. The Australians had not conquered the province. They had made it uninhabitable for the enemy. And their own losses? 3 men. In 5 years of continuous combat operations, behind enemy lines, surrounded by a force that numbered in the hundreds of thousands, 3. A ratio of 170 to 1. A captured North Vietnamese officer, interrogated in 1969, revealed the standing orders that had been issued to his battalion regarding Australian SAS contact. If you see them, do not engage. Report the location and withdraw immediately. They always have support and they never lose. That last part was not entirely accurate, but the perception was total. And in psychological warfare, perception is the only reality that matters. The Australian SAS packed their gear and flew home in 1971 to a country that was largely indifferent to what they had done. No parades, no monuments, no classified files declassified to show the public what had been achieved in those 5 years of silent, patient, devastating work. The Americans continued their war for 4 more years, loud, costly, and ultimately unsuccessful. But the lessons of the phantoms did not die in the jungle. Today, special forces units around the world, from the British SAS to the American Navy SEALs, to every elite counterterrorism unit operating in the shadows, study the Australian operations in Vietnam as foundational examples of how small unit warfare, conducted with patience and precision, can achieve outcomes that no amount of firepower can replicate. They study Iron Jim's 43 minutes in the dirt. They study Spider's Web. They study the rescue that the Marines refused. They study the sniper duel in the monsoon rain. Former Viet Cong commander Trong Nhu Tang, writing decades later in his memoirs, offered the tribute that no medal ceremony ever could. The American military was powerful but predictable. The Australians were different, patient, precise, and terrifying in their efficiency. We feared them because they fought like we did, only better. The jungle of Phuc Tuy has grown back over the battlefields now. The bunkers have collapsed. The bomb craters have filled with rain and 30 years of vegetation. The trails they walked are gone. But if you understand what war really is, not the loudness of it, not the machinery of it, the cold, quiet, patient discipline at its core, then you understand what those 600 men proved in 5 years of silence. An army of 500,000 could not win Vietnam, but a handful of men who understood patience, who had learned to become part of the jungle rather than fight against it, who chose the scalpel over the hammer every single time. Those men were never defeated, not once, not ever, because they understood something that the history books still struggle to say simply. The most terrifying thing on a battlefield is not the loudest weapon. It is the enemy you cannot find. And in Vietnam, the phantoms were never found.